Mandeep Singh, and I will be discussing to you post-impressionism. So I'll be talking about the history and background of post-impressionism, the characteristics of post-impressionism, key post-impressionists, and the famous post-impression art, and also the hermeneutics. So let us begin with the history and background of post-impressionism. Post-impressionism is a term used to describe the reaction in the 1880s against impressionism. It was a movement centered in France. So the movement was led by Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Jorge Seurat. So post-impressionism roughly started from 1886, which was the year of the last Impressionist exhibition. In the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886, younger artists and critics demanded a shift in the focus of the representational arts. The artists during the time felt that Impressionists allowed their preoccupations with technique and the effects of natural light to overshadow the importance of subject matter. Post-Impressionists favored an emphasis on more symbolic content, formal order, and structure. Post-Impressionism can be defined as a rejection of Impressionist concern for the naturalistic depiction of light and color in favor of an emphasis on abstract qualities or symbolic content. Post-Impressionism encompasses a wide range of distinct artistic styles that all share the common motivation of responding to the opticality of the Impressionist movement. Post-Impressionism is characterized by a subjective approach to painting, as artists opted to evoke emotion rather than realism in their work. Post-Impressionism is known for the diverse yet distinctive styles of subjective perceptions of the world around them. Post-Impressionism was more of a period of painting rather than a style or movement. It was a time when many artists went their own way and developed their own style, creating varying styles in the time period. The movement changed the traditional role of painting, which during the time was the window onto the world, instead became a window into the artist's mind and soul. Eventually, these artists who used their mind and soul became known as the post-impressionists, a term that grouped together widely varying individual artistic styles. So, post-impressionist artists were not unified by a single aesthetic approach. Rather, what brought them together was a shared interest in openly exploring the mind of the artist. While the artists have their own style of painting, artwork during these times had similarities that include symbolic motifs, a natural color, and painterly brushstrokes. So next guys, let us talk about the characteristics of post-impressionism art. There are three main characteristics which help us to know if the artwork is part of post-impressionism. So the first characteristic is emotional symbolism. Post-impressionists believe that the work of art should not revolve around style, process, or aesthetic approach. It should place emphasis on symbolism, communicating messages from the artist's own subconscious. Post-impressionists perceived it as a way to convey feelings. According to Paul Cézanne, a work of art which did not begin in emotion is not a work of art. The second characteristic is evocative color. Post-impressionists purposely employed an artificial color palette as a way to portray their emotion and drive perception of the world around them. Saturated hues, multicolor shadows, and rich ranges of color are commonly seen in most post-impressionist paintings, proving that artists' innovative and imaginative approach to representation. And in the words of Paul Gauguin, color, what a deep and mysterious language, the language of dreams. So the third characteristic is distinctive brushstrokes. Most post-impressionist artwork feature discernible and broad brushstrokes. In addition to adding texture and a sense of depth to a work of art, these marks also point to the painterly qualities of the piece, making it clear that it is not intended to be a realistic representation of the subject. These three characteristics are evident in most post-impressionist art. Now, let us talk about the famous post-impressionists. So the first artist is Paul Cézanne. The famed painter was born on January 19, 1839 in France. His father, Philip Auguste, was the co-founder of a banking firm that prospered throughout the artist's life, affording him financial security that was unavailable to most of his contemporaries, and eventually resulting in a large inheritance. In 1852, Cézanne entered the College Bourbon, where he met and befriended Émile Zola. They envisioned successful careers in Paris' booming art industry, Cézanne as a painter and Zola as a writer. The work of post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne is said to have formed the bridge between 19th century Impressionism and the early 20th century's new line of artistic inquiry, Cubism. The mastery of design, tone, composition, and color that spans his life's work is highly characteristic and now recognizable around the world. Both Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso were greatly influenced by Cézanne. The second post-impressionist is Paul Gauguin. The French artist was born in Paris on June 7, 1848. Paul Gauguin created his own unique painting style, much like he crafted his own distinctive path through life. He is known for bold colors, simplified forms, and strong lines. He didn't have any formal art training. He followed his own vision, abandoning both his family and artistic conventions. He was an important figure in the symbolist art movement of the early 1900s. His use of bold colors, exaggerated body proportions, and stark contrast in his paintings set him apart from the contemporaries, helping to pave the way for primitivism art movement. Gauguin often sought exotic environments and spent most of its time living in Tahiti. So the third post-impressionist is Georges Seurat. He was born on December 2, 1859 in Paris, France. He began his formal art education around 1875 when he began attending a local art school and studying under the sculptor Justin Lequesne. After training at the École des Beaux-Arts, Jorge Seurat broke free of tradition, taking his technique a step beyond Impressionism. He painted with small strokes of pure color that seemed to blend when viewed from a distance. This method, called pointillism, is showcased in major works of the 1880s, such as A Sunday on La Grande Jatte. Seurat's career was cut short when he died of illness on March 29, 1891 in Paris. Another famous post-impressionist artist is Vincent van Gogh. He was born on March 30, 1853 in Groot-Zundert, Netherlands. Vincent van Gogh was a post-impressionist painter whose work was notable for its beauty, emotion, and color. Highly influenced 20th century art. He struggled with mental illness and remained poor and virtually unknown throughout his life. These famous post-impressionists have their own distinct taste. Symbolic and highly personal meanings were very important to post-impressionists such as Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh. They rejected interest in depicting the observed world. Instead, looked to their emotions in order to connect with the viewer on a deeper level. Structure, order, and the optical effects of color dominated the artistic vision of post-impressionists like Paul Cézanne and Georges Seurat. Rather than merely representing their surroundings, they relied upon interrelations of color and shape to describe the world around them. So, after talking about the famous post-impressionist artists, we will be looking at the famous post-impression art. So, the first painting is done by Jorge Seurat, which is called The Large Bathers. It was painted around the 1900s to 1906. Many consider the painting as Cézanne's masterpiece. Cézanne employed the technique of constructing visually complex images composed of simple shapes, lines, and geometric forms, built up from the canvas with thick impasto. He composed the bathers, trees, and landscape from plane of color and applied the paint with a palette knife, not a brush. This visual effect caused the forms of the bathers' bodies into the foreground to merge into the branches of the trees in the landscape behind them. The visual slippage heralded the future of modernist painting. The spatial ambiguity of the bathers and Cézanne's emphasis on formal structure paved the way for the visual experimentation of Cubism. The second painting was painted by Paul Gauguin, which is called The Vision After the Sermon. It was painted in 1888. The painting, which depicts a revelatory vision of Jacob wrestling with an angel, clearly shows reality and spiritual manifestation through aesthetic form. While the crowd of churchgoers who experience the vision is in the foreground, the biblical struggle appears in the background, surrounded by a two-dimensional and vibrantly colored plane. Gauguin relied upon the abstraction of the red crown to communicate the space of the vision as well as heightened emotions present at the religious revelation. As his work demonstrates, Gauguin rejected the conventions of the industrialized modern society in both his art and his life, through romanticized evocations of the primitive and the incorporeal and the mystical. In doing so, he helped initiate the individualized expressionistic vein of avant-garde art that influenced generations of artists throughout the 20th century. Another famous post-impressionistic painting was painted by Vincent van Gogh, which is called the Portrait of Dr. Gachet. It was painted in 1890. In the Portrait of Dr. Gachet, Van Gogh strove to elicit a complex mixture of emotions within the viewer, rather than portray a naturalistic description of the sitter. Van Gogh created painterly rhythms and swirling forms within the arrangement of the figure in order to convey the elements of strength, intelligence, and melancholy. Van Gogh epitomized the rejection of impressionistic optical observation in favor of an emotionally laden representation that appealed to the viewer's heart rather than his mind. So let us now move on to the last part of my discussion, which is hermeneutics. Post-impressionism was an art movement which started in France that began in the 1880s. Post-impressionism is a term used to describe the reaction in the 1880s against impressionism. Post-impressionists rejected the impressionism's concern for naturalistic depiction of light and color in favor of an emphasis on abstract qualities or symbolic content. Post-impressionists favored an emphasis on more symbolic content, formal order, and structure. Post-impressionist artists were not unified by a single aesthetic approach. Rather, what brought them together was a shared interest in openly exploring the mind of the artist. Paul Gauguin's Vision After the Sermon. It depicts a vision of Jacob wrestling with an angel, which depicts reality and spirituality in the aesthetic form. Gauguin combined two levels of reality in the painting. It portrays both the real and the dream world. So the foreground is filled by a group of women dressed in traditional Breton costumes as they return from the Mass. The background depicts the biblical scene of Jacob's battle with an angel. Gauguin used the abstraction of red ground to show the space of the vision as well as heightened emotions present at the religious revelation. This artwork ignores the rules of perspective. The figures on the foreground are too large and almost block the view of the wrestlers, who would normally have been central to the composition. So the color palette used pure vermilion as the background and the figures as violent ultramarine, bottle green, pure chrome yellow, and orange. So his sketchbooks are often interspersed with diagrams, notes, and the addresses in preparation for the vision after the sermon. So the painting shows a bright color of red in the background, which makes the woman stand out. The tree trunk in the middle divides the two scenes, creating a division between the two. Post-impressionism was more of a period of painting rather than a style or movement. It was a time when many artists went their own way and developed their own style. So, post-impressionists were brought together by shared interest in openly exploring the mind of the artist, influencing artists to create art with their own emotions rather than what is present. Post-impressionist influence group that arose during the turn of the 20th century. During the end of the period of Impressionism, artists began to reject the traditional style of painting done by Impressionists, creating their own path. Post-Impressionists disregarded standard norms of Impressionism and began painting with their own style. Post-Impressionists moved forward and brought emotion to their artworks and showed their feeling to the masses. This helped push the boundaries of art today.